What if the most loving gesture was actually a murder attempt? Imagine this. Your husband shows up at your office unannounced. He's smiling. He's gentle. He's holding a home-cooked breakfast made just for you. On paper, it looks like love. But deep down, something feels wrong. The kind of wrong you can't explain, only feel so you don't eat it. Instead, you pass it to someone else. An hour later, the office erupts in screams, blood, chaos, a woman convulsing on the floor. And suddenly, the horrifying truth begins to surface, not just about the food, but about betrayal, greed, and a man willing to destroy his own unborn child to protect his empire. This isn't just a story about infidelity. It's a story about power, control, and how instinct, that quiet inner voice, can sometimes be the only thing standing between life and death. Because that breakfast wasn't made with love. It was made with poison. And the wrong person ate it. The morning began like any other, quiet and predictable. The kind of routine that lulls you into believing life is stable. Sunlight filtered through the tall office windows, stretching across polished wood and neatly stacked reports. As Zinaya settled into her chair, already bracing herself for another demanding day, nothing suggested danger. Nothing hinted that this ordinary morning would soon fracture her understanding of the man she called her husband. Then the door opened. Not a knock. Not a call from his assistant. Just him, Travante, standing there with a pale blue thermal container in his hands and a smile that felt unfamiliar, warm, almost nostalgic. The kind of smile she hadn't seen in months. He greeted her softly, almost tenderly, wishing her a happy anniversary, as if time itself had rewound to a version of their marriage that no longer existed. And that was the first crack. Because when affection returns without warning, especially after months of emotional distance, it doesn't always mean love is healing. Sometimes, it means something is being hidden. Travante explained himself too easily. He said he'd woken up before dawn, cooked her favorite soul food, slow-cooked it with care, just to help her regain strength. He spoke like a man performing devotion, emphasizing effort, sacrifice, intention. But Zinaya wasn't listening to the words as much as she was watching his eyes. They didn't sparkle with concern. They searched, measured, calculated. And when he opened the container, the steam rose thick and heavy, carrying a sharp animal scent that hit her like a wall. Her stomach twisted violently. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that she was 3 months pregnant, and pregnancy had turned her senses against her. Strong smells triggered waves of nausea so intense they bordered on pain. She forced a smile, lied gently, said she'd already eaten. But Travante insisted. His voice stayed soft, but the pressure underneath it was unmistakable. This wasn't care, it was expectation. And suddenly, a simple breakfast felt less like a gift, and more like a test. Then came the interruption, a knock at the door, perfectly timed. The new secretary stepped in, young, confident, dressed sharply, her presence shifting the energy in the room. She noticed the container immediately, commented on it. Admired Travante openly, her tone light, flirtatious, lingering just a second too long. Zinaya watched the interaction carefully. Travante didn't correct her, didn't redirect the attention. He simply left, offering final instructions before walking away. And in that quiet moment, as the door closed behind him, instinct took over. That quiet voice people often ignore. The one that whispers instead of shouts, spoke clearly. Zinaya smiled, pushed the container toward the secretary, and suggested she eat it instead. Waste would be a shame, she said. The food was still hot. The secretary's reaction was instant delight, gratitude, excitement. She clutched the container like a prize and left the office glowing. Relief washed over Zinaya, but it didn't last. Because instinct doesn't just warn, it waits. And deep down, something still felt wrong. An hour later, the building erupted. A loud crash echoed through the floor, followed by a scream so sharp it cut through every wall, every conversation, every sense of normalcy. This wasn't panic. This was agony. Zinaya ran toward the sound, her heart pounding harder with every step, dread flooding her chest before she even reached the scene. What she saw stopped her cold. The secretary lay on the floor, convulsing, foam at her mouth, blood spreading beneath her dress, the overturned container spilling its contents across the carpet. The smell, vomit mixed with stew, was unbearable. People screamed. Someone called for an ambulance, and then Travanti appeared, but he didn't rush to help. He didn't kneel beside the dying woman. His eyes locked onto the blood, onto the food, and finally, onto Zinaya. The look on his face wasn't shock, it wasn't fear, it was rage. Pure, unfiltered rage, the kind reserved for someone who just realized their plan has failed. In that moment, the truth surfaced, sharp and terrifying, that breakfast wasn't meant to nourish her. It was meant to end something. And if she hadn't listened to that quiet, uncomfortable feeling, the woman bleeding on the floor wouldn't have been the secretary. It would have been her. For a few suspended seconds, no one seemed to know what to do. The office, usually a controlled, polished environment of deadlines and decorum, dissolved into chaos. Papers were abandoned mid-sentence, chairs scraped back violently, and people ran toward the sound without understanding what they were about to see. Zinaya stood frozen at the edge of the growing crowd, her heartbeat pounding so loudly it drowned out the shouting around her. On the floor lay the secretary, her body twisting unnaturally, fingers clawing at her own abdomen as if trying to tear the pain out from inside. Blood seeped across the carpet in a slow, horrifying bloom. The container lay overturned nearby, its contents scattered like evidence no one yet dared to name. This wasn't a fainting spell. This wasn't food poisoning in a casual sense. This was something violent, deliberate, and the longer Zinaya stared, the more one terrible realization pressed against her chest, that food had been meant for her. The smell alone was overwhelming. The stew's heavy scent mixed with bile and iron, turning the air thick and suffocating. Some employees gagged. Others cried openly. Someone shouted instructions they weren't qualified to give. In the middle of it all, the secretary's beautiful, composed image shattered completely. Her face had gone ashen, lips tinged blue, eyes rolling back as her body convulsed uncontrollably. Blood continued to spread, soaking into the carpet fibers as if marking the floor with an irreversible truth. Zinaya's legs trembled, her mind racing through the last hour on a brutal loop. The container, Travanti's insistence, his disappointment when she refused, her sudden decision to give the food away. Every detail snapped into place with chilling clarity. This wasn't coincidence, this wasn't bad luck, this was a near miss. An instinct, not logic, not evidence, had just saved her life. Then Travanti arrived. He pushed through the crowd with an expression Zinaya had never seen before, not even during their worst arguments. Panic, yes, but not concern. His eyes darted first to the blood, then to the overturned container, lingering there just a fraction too long. He didn't ask if the secretary was alive. He didn't call her name. Instead, his gaze snapped upward and locked onto Zinaya like a blade finding its target. What crossed his face in that instant wasn't fear for an employee or shock at a workplace emergency. It was fury. Raw, unfiltered fury. He stormed toward her and grabbed her arm hard enough to hurt, his voice low, shaking with rage as he demanded to know why she had done it, why she had given the food away. The question made no sense to anyone else, but to Zinaya it was deafening. Why her? Why not you? That single illogical outburst shattered the last illusion she had left about the man she married. As the sirens wailed in the distance and paramedics rushed in, the truth settled like ice in Zinaya's veins. Travanti hadn't planned an accident. He hadn't made a mistake. He had planned an outcome. And the wrong woman was lying on the floor. When the secretary was finally wheeled away, pale and barely conscious, Travanti didn't stay behind in shock. He followed the stretcher with desperation, not relief, not remorse, but fear. Fear that something had gone wrong. Fear that the story wouldn't stay buried. Before disappearing into the elevator, he turned back and ordered Zinaya to come to the hospital. his tone sharp, commanding, already shifting blame. In that moment, standing in the wreckage of a normal morning, Zinaya understood something that changed everything. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a crime that had failed by chance, and now that it had failed, the real danger wasn't over. It was just beginning. Hospitals have a way of stripping people bare. Under fluorescent lights and sterile walls, there's nowhere to hide who you really are. As Zinaya sat in the cold waiting room chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap, she watched Travante pace back and forth like a trapped animal. His suit, always immaculate, was wrinkled now, his movements sharp, restless. But what struck her most wasn't his anxiety, it was what he wasn't worried about. He didn't ask nurses about the secretary's condition with genuine concern. He didn't speak about shock or confusion or disbelief. Instead, his eyes kept darting towards Zinaya, calculating, suspicious, as if she were the problem that needed managing. That's when it hit her. People can cry, shout, panic, but eyes don't lie, and his eyes were screaming one thing very clearly. He wasn't afraid she might die. He was afraid the truth might live. When the doctor finally emerged, the room fell silent. The diagnosis landed like a hammer blow: acute poisoning, severe hemorrhaging. And then a word that shifted the ground beneath everyone's feet: misoprostol, a drug used to induce contractions. A drug that had no business being in a homemade breakfast. Zinaya watched Travante's face drain of color as the explanation continued. This wasn't accidental contamination. This wasn't spoiled food. The dosage was intentional, extreme, dangerous. The doctor explained it plainly, almost clinically, but the implications were monstrous. Police will be notified. Protocol demanded it. At that moment, before anyone else could speak, Travante recovered just enough to do something chillingly predictable. He pointed at Zinaya. He suggested jealousy, impulse, rage. He implied that she, his wife, must have tampered with the food. In one breath, he transformed from concerned husband to calculated accuser. And that betrayal cut deeper than the poison ever could. Zinaya didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She did something far more dangerous. She stayed calm. She pointed out facts, cameras, fingerprints, timelines, and most importantly, she asked the question no one else dared to ask aloud. If the food was meant to care for her, why did it contain a drug designed to terminate a pregnancy? The room shifted. Officers exchanged glances. Travante began contradicting himself, insisting only he had prepared the stew, not realizing that every word tightened the noose around his own neck. Because if the poison was already dissolved evenly into the food, it meant one thing. It had been added during cooking, not afterward, not in her office, not by accident. The mask was slipping, and everyone could feel it. Then came the revelation that turned tragedy into cruel irony. The secretary, the woman writhing on the office floor, had been pregnant, 6 weeks along. The overdose had caused violent contractions. The fetus hadn't survived. Travante collapsed into a chair, his body folding in on itself as if gravity had finally caught up to him. But Zinaya felt no satisfaction, no triumph. Only a hollow disgust. The poison meant for her had destroyed his secret child instead. Fate hadn't shown mercy, it had delivered judgment. Sitting there, hand instinctively resting on her own stomach, Zinaya understood the full scope of the man she married. He wasn't just unfaithful, he wasn't just cruel. He was capable of sacrificing anyone, wife, mistress, child, to protect his power. And now, with police involved and lies unraveling, the question was no longer if he would fall. It was how far he would drag others down with him first. The hospital hallway slowly transformed into a crime scene without anyone announcing it. The soft murmur of nurses gave way to clipped questions, notepads, and the unmistakable presence of law enforcement. 2 officers arrived quietly, but their uniforms carried weight. This was no longer a domestic misunderstanding or a workplace accident. It was an investigation. Zinaya sat across from one of them, her posture steady despite the storm raging inside her. She recounted the morning in precise detail. The unexpected visit, the unopened container, the nausea she couldn't explain without revealing her pregnancy, and the moment she passed the food to the secretary. She emphasized what mattered most. She never touched the food beyond opening the lid, never altered it, never left it unattended. Every word was measured, not defensive. Across the hall, Travante was being questioned separately, his voice louder, faster, already laced with desperation. Travante's version sounded rehearsed. He spoke proudly of waking before dawn, of cooking alone, of being meticulous. He insisted no one else had touched the stew, not the housekeeper, not an assistant, not even the air itself. He believed this showed devotion. In reality, it boxed him in. Because if the stew was poisoned and the medical evidence was undeniable, then the poison had entered the pot under his watch. The officers noticed the contradictions immediately. The more he spoke, the more he distanced himself from any plausible explanation. Zinaya watched from afar, recognizing the pattern. This was the man she married, confident in control, blind to consequence. He was so used to shaping narratives that he didn't realize this one was shaping him instead. The forensic results arrived like a verdict. The toxic substance wasn't sprinkled or introduced after the fact. It was fully dissolved, infused into every bite of the stew. That detail changed everything. It confirmed intention, it confirmed timing, and it obliterated Travante's attempt to redirect blame. When confronted, he unraveled. He suggested the secretary had taken the drug herself. He hinted at depression. He grasped for theories that collapsed the moment they left his mouth. Zinaya finally spoke, her voice cutting through his frantic noise with devastating clarity. If the secretary took the drug independently, why was it in the food? Logic, simple and unforgiving, stood where emotion once lived. The officers exchanged one last look. They didn't need to say it aloud. The truth was standing right in front of them. As Travante was escorted away for further questioning, Zinaya remained seated, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. The hallway felt colder now, emptier, as if something rotten had finally been exposed to air. She realized the danger wasn't over, not yet. Men like Travante didn't collapse quietly. They fought. They blamed. They destroyed. But for the first time since that pale blue container appeared on her desk, Zinaya felt something stronger than fear. Clarity. The poison had missed its intended target, but it had revealed everything else. And now that police reports were written, evidence collected, and lies unraveling, the man who tried to erase her future had unknowingly triggered the beginning of his own end. The moment Travante realized the investigation wasn't bending in his favor, his strategy shifted. No more pleading. No more confusion. This was the phase he knew best: survival through manipulation. While police reviewed statements and forensic reports, he began planting seeds quietly, carefully, like a man who had rehearsed this kind of betrayal long before the poison ever touched the pot. He spoke of Zinaya's recent mood changes, hinted at jealousy, suggested emotional instability. To anyone willing to listen, he painted a portrait of a wife unraveling under pressure. It was subtle enough to sound reasonable, dangerous enough to stick. Zinaya watched it unfold in real time, the realization settling in with brutal clarity. He wasn't just trying to save himself. He was preparing to sacrifice her. What hurt most wasn't the accusation itself. It was how easily it came to him. This wasn't panic speaking. This was instinct. He had already constructed a narrative where she was the villain and he was the victim. A jealous wife, a threatened position, a tragic overreaction. It was almost elegant in its cruelty. Zinaya began to understand that the breakfast hadn't been an impulsive act either. It had been calculated, just like this. He assumed she would eat it quietly, suffer quietly, miscarry quietly. And if questions arose, he would grieve publicly and move on untouched. The only flaw in the plan was her refusal to play the role he assigned her, the silent casualty. Behind the scenes, however, facts continued to work against him. Security footage confirmed timelines. Phone records showed patterns of communication that didn't match his story. Financial transactions raised new questions. The more Travante pushed his version of events, the more attention investigators paid to the gaps in it. Zinnia, meanwhile, stayed composed. She answered questions once clearly without embellishment. She didn't chase sympathy. She didn't argue. She let truth do what lies never could, hold its shape under pressure. And slowly, the officer's tone toward her softened. Toward Travante, it sharpened. Late that night, alone at last, Zinnia sat in silence and finally allowed herself to feel the weight of what almost happened. She placed a hand over her abdomen, breathing slowly, grounding herself in the quiet proof of life still there. This wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. This was about protecting her future and ensuring that the man who tried to erase it could never get close enough to try again. Travante had chosen his move. He had drawn the line. And now, unknowingly, he had given her permission to stop being careful. Because when someone tries to frame you for a crime meant to kill you, survival is no longer passive. It becomes a decision. Every crime has a flaw, a moment the perpetrator assumes no one will ever notice. In Travante's case, it was an hour that didn't exist on paper but loomed large everywhere else. Security footage showed his car entering the building's garage early that morning, a full hour before he appeared at Zinya's office with the breakfast. An hour unaccounted for. An hour with no meetings, no calls logged, no witnesses willing to vouch for him. Investigators noticed it immediately, but it was Zinya's quiet persistence that kept the focus there. Time, after all, doesn't lie, it only waits. And the longer that missing hour sat unexplained, the heavier it became. Digging deeper revealed movement where there shouldn't have been any. Footage from a rarely used stairwell showed a familiar silhouette slipping through the shadows, Travante's personal assistant and distant cousin. He wasn't carrying documents. He wasn't headed to a meeting. He was hauling a black trash bag, moving deliberately, avoiding elevators, avoiding cameras. The route he took wasn't efficient. It was hidden. When questioned, his explanations came out tangled and incomplete. Zinya watched the footage again and again, recognizing the posture, the gait, the obedience of a man accustomed to cleaning up messes that weren't his own. The bag disappeared near the dumpsters shortly before the building's garbage was collected. Too neat, too late. As investigators pieced together financial records, another layer emerged: shell companies. Rent payments for a luxury apartment registered under an unfamiliar corporate name. Transfers masked as representation expenses. The money trail didn't scream passion, it whispered planning. The secretary hadn't been living on ambition alone, she had been maintained. And the missing hour now made sense. It wasn't idle time. It was preparation, disposal, erasure. Travante hadn't just tried to poison someone. He had tried to erase every breadcrumb that could lead back to him. He underestimated one thing. How many systems record movement when people believe they're unseen? By the end of the day, the investigation had shifted tone entirely. This was no longer about suspicion, it was about reconstruction. Zinaya sat with the weight of it all pressing down on her, realizing how close she'd come to disappearing inside that missing hour herself. The truth wasn't hiding anymore. It was surfacing, piece by piece, pulled up from trash bins, bank statements, and blind spots that weren't blind enough. Travante thought he controlled time. But time had already betrayed him. And with every minute that passed, the gap he couldn't explain grew wider, dragging his carefully built lie straight into the light. The truth surfaced quietly, almost cruelly, the way the most devastating facts often do. It wasn't announced with drama or outrage. It arrived in a medical sentence, spoken calmly by a tired doctor in a hospital corridor. The secretary had been pregnant, 6 weeks along. The overdose of the drug had caused violent contractions, hemorrhaging, and the inevitable outcome no one could undo. The fetus didn't survive. In that moment, the story twisted into something far darker than betrayal or attempted murder. This wasn't just a plan gone wrong. It was a tragic collision of secrets, where the poison meant to erase one unborn life had instead destroyed another. Fate hadn't intervened gently. It had struck with brutal irony. Travante's reaction told its own story. When the words landed, his knees buckled. He collapsed into a chair, face hollow, eyes staring at nothing. To an outsider, it might have looked like grief. But Zinaya saw something else: shock, yes, but also realization. A realization that whatever control he thought he had was gone. The woman he was trying to protect his wealth from had survived. The child he never acknowledged had not. And in that instant, the consequences he never considered became permanent. Zinaya felt no victory watching him fall apart. Only revulsion. Because no matter how the story was spun, one truth was inescapable: his actions had killed his own child. As investigators connected the dots, the affair ceased being rumor and became fact. Financial support, secret housing, constant communication. The secretary hadn't just been a workplace temptation, she had been part of a parallel life. And that life had intersected violently with the one Travante was trying to preserve. The pregnancy explained everything he hadn't planned for: urgency, risk, desperation. A child meant exposure. Exposure meant division of assets, loss of reputation, loss of control. The stew wasn't about love or care. It was about erasing a problem before it spoke. And in trying to silence one future, he annihilated another. Zinaya sat alone afterward, hand resting protectively on her stomach, absorbing the weight of what survival truly meant. She was alive because she listened to a feeling she couldn't explain. Her child still lived because fate chose cruelty elsewhere, but there was no comfort in that exchange. Only responsibility. Responsibility to ensure the truth didn't stop here. Responsibility to make sure the story didn't end with a convenient scapegoat or a quiet settlement. Travante had crossed a line where forgiveness didn't exist. And now that the full cost of his choices was visible, in blood, in loss, in silence, there was no turning back. What followed wouldn't be mercy. It would be accountability. Up until now, Zinaya had been reacting, surviving moment to moment, answering questions, absorbing shocks. But survival has a breaking point, and beyond it lies resolve. Sitting alone in her office, rain streaking down the glass like quiet applause for everything collapsing behind the scenes, she made a decision. She would stop waiting for the truth to stumble forward on its own. She would guide it. With the help of her trusted assistant, she began pulling threads others had overlooked: security footage, internal records, and private financial data that told a story far more damning than any emotional testimony ever could. This wasn't revenge. This was control reclaimed. And once she stepped into that role, the balance of power shifted. The first real crack came from an unexpected place: fear. Travante's inner circle was unraveling, especially the people who had helped him quietly, thinking loyalty would protect them. His assistant, the same man seen disposing of evidence during the missing hour, began making mistakes. Phone calls at odd hours. Attempts to access locked systems. Nervous explanations that didn't match the logs. Zinaya didn't confront him directly. She didn't need to. Silence can be louder than accusation. She let him panic, let him understand he was no longer invisible. And as fear grew, so did carelessness. That was all she needed. Then came the breakthrough, proof of how the poison was obtained. Records pointed toward a former acquaintance of Travante's, someone with access to restricted medication, someone who trusted him enough to believe his lies. Messages, timestamps, and quiet transfers painted a clear picture of coordination. This wasn't a spontaneous act fueled by jealousy or rage. It was procurement, planning, instruction. Travante hadn't just wanted the outcome, he had engineered the process. Zinaya gathered everything carefully, duplicating files, securing backups, ensuring nothing could be erased in a moment of desperation. She had learned from him after all. The difference was that she wasn't hiding. She was preparing. By the time authorities followed up with new questions, Zinaya wasn't defensive, she was ready. She didn't accuse, she presented. Evidence doesn't shout. It waits patiently to be understood. And as officers reviewed the materials, the tone of the investigation changed again. This was no longer about what might have happened. It was about how far the damage extended and who else was involved. Travanti had believed the chaos would protect him. Instead, it exposed him. Watching the momentum finally turn, Zinaya felt something unexpected settle in her chest. Not relief, not triumph, but certainty. The truth was no longer fragile. It was inevitable. The boardroom had witnessed plenty of power plays before, but never one like this. Executives sat stiffly around the long-polished table, the air heavy with unease, whispers dying the moment Zinaya walked in. Travanti was already there, seated at the head as always, suit pressed, posture confident, at least on the surface. To anyone who didn't know what lay beneath, he still looked like the untouchable CEO. But Zinaya saw the cracks immediately. The slight tremor in his hand. The way his eyes avoided hers. The tension masked behind authority. This meeting had been scheduled to discuss company strategy, but everyone in the room could feel it. Something else was about to happen. Something irreversible. When the meeting began, Travanti spoke first, attempting to steer the conversation toward numbers, projections, future growth. It was classic deflection, bury the truth under data. Zinaya let him finish. She didn't interrupt. Then, calmly she stood. The sound of her chair sliding back echoed louder than it should have. She spoke without emotion, without accusation, asking one simple question: whether the board believed a company could thrive under leadership facing an active criminal investigation involving fraud, illegal pharmaceuticals, and attempted murder. Silence followed. The kind that presses against your ears. Before Travanti could respond, she connected her device to the screen. The evidence unfolded piece by piece. Financial transfers disguised as expenses, shell companies. Lease agreements for a luxury apartment tied back to company funds. Audio records, messages, timelines. Faces around the table shifted from confusion to disbelief to anger. One by one, the board members realized this wasn't a domestic scandal bleeding into business. The business itself had been used as a tool in the crime. Travanti stood abruptly, shouting that it was a setup, that his wife was manipulating facts, that everything was fabricated. But outrage doesn't erase evidence, it only confirms desperation. Security stepped forward as his voice cracked, and in that moment, his authority evaporated. The final blow came quietly, a formal motion. A vote. Immediate suspension pending investigation. Travanti sank back into his chair, the weight of the room crushing down on him as the title he'd protected at all costs was stripped away in minutes. Zinaya didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She simply watched, understanding that power doesn't vanish loudly, it collapses inward. As officers entered the room moments later, ready to escort him away for questioning, she felt no triumph, only closure. The man who once believed he controlled every outcome had been undone not by emotion, but by truth presented at the right moment. And as the doors closed behind him, one thing became clear. This chapter wasn't the end of the story, but the end of his control over it. In the days that followed, the world didn't stop spinning, it simply revealed itself more clearly. News of Travanti's arrest rippled quietly through the company, then outward into headlines and whispered conversations. Charges stacked up methodically: financial crimes, illegal procurement of controlled substances, conspiracy, attempted harm. The man who once commanded rooms with confidence now sat in interrogation spaces where power meant nothing. Zinaya watched from a distance, not out of vengeance but necessity. Justice, she learned, isn't loud or cinematic in real life. It moves slowly, deliberately, carried forward by paperwork, testimony, and evidence that refuses to disappear. And this time, the truth wasn't alone. As the legal process unfolded, Zinaya focused on rebuilding, not the company, not her public image, but herself. She stepped away from the home that no longer felt safe, surrounded herself with people who didn't ask her to explain or defend her survival. Each morning, she placed a hand over her stomach, grounding herself in the quiet reminder of why she endured. Her child had become her compass, her reason to choose clarity over bitterness. The fear that once followed her like a shadow began to loosen its grip. She wasn't defined by what was done to her, she was defined by what she refused to let happen next. The secretary survived, though the cost was devastating. The loss she carried would never be undone, and Zinnia understood that accountability didn't erase pain, it simply acknowledged it. There were no neat endings, no perfect balance. Some scars would remain permanent, but lies had been dismantled. Power had been exposed, and silence had been broken. That mattered. Because for every detail that came to light, another woman somewhere would recognize the warning signs sooner. Another voice might trust instinct instead of dismissing it. Another life might be spared by listening to that quiet, inconvenient feeling. In the end, this was never just a story about poison. It was about perception. How love can be weaponized, how control disguises itself as care, and how survival sometimes hinges on a single choice that feels small in the moment. Zinnia didn't win because she was stronger or smarter. She survived because she listened. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling truth of all. Danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it arrives in a warm container, with a smile, asking you to eat. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is say no, even when you don't yet know why.